Molly was a 67-year-old retiree who lived across the highway from a provincial park. She had grown up in that house, raised her own children in that house, and now had grandkids who would visit her occasionally. Ever since she was a girl, her father had told her stories about a Wendigo in the park, and she was never to leave the house after dark. In middle age, she had heard many of these stories corroborated by park rangers that she spoke to on the way to work. A good friend of hers from elementary school, Michael, now a park ranger, had 10 years ago told her the story of two boys who found a Wendigo devouring their father and narrowly escaped in their RV. But it wasn't until old age that the Wendigo spoke to Molly, when the last of her kids had finally moved out and she lay in bed alone. The first time was 5 years ago. She could hear it creeping up to her bedroom window from the outside. The way the foundation of her house shook, she knew it was large. It breathed for a moment and then asked,
"Who's in there?"
Molly didn't reply. She was terrified, but after a moment of quiet, the creature seemed to know it was her.
"You must be Molly. I knew your father many years ago. I told him I would eat you."
Molly looked out the window to see the creature's face, a glowing red eye peeking through the curtains with a horizontal black pupil. It was ugly, very ugly, the face of a goat and the antlers of a deer. At its height, she knew that its arm must be able to smash through the window and reach her in her bed, and yet the Wendigo stayed put. And intermittently, over the last 5 years, the Wendigo had kept returning on occasion to talk to her as she lay in her bed. It would tell her about humans it ate, some after stalking for years. It knew every intimate detail of their lives, who they were as people. And there was even a tone of admiration as he relayed these stories, but they all ended the same, with them screaming, being devoured as he easily overpowered them. He had a particular liking for children, finding their meat to be the most succulent and their screams the most sweet. And at every encounter in the last 5 years, the creature had asked nothing else of Molly, and she had not uttered a single word to it. She merely listened, and he merely shared. And in that present day, Molly was no longer afraid of these visits. She was disgusted by the creature and these stories he would tell. She hated him for the way he described the campers in the park across the street. She wasn't sure why he wanted to speak to her. Was he trying to torment her, or trying to cleanse himself of some inkling of guilt? Ultimately, it mattered not. One day, a car pulled up in the driveway, an unexpected visit from her grandson, John. He had a couple friends in the back seat. Molly invited them in for sandwiches. When asked the reason for the visit, John explained that he and his friends were going camping in the provincial park across the highway, and figured they'd stop in and say hello. This filled Molly with dread, and not wanting to make a scene, she pulled John aside and asked him, "Do you remember the stories I used to tell you when you were young?" John could see the real concern behind her eyes, but assured her that she was just a bit superstitious, and that everything would be fine. "John, if you had seen the things I have seen, you would not take what I'm saying lightly," Molly implored him. "Well, what have you seen?" John asked. Molly told John about the past 5 years, and he calmly listened. When she was done, he got up, walked back out to the kitchen, and told his friends it was time to go. He thought she was crazy. He thought she'd lost her mind. Before they left for the campground, John told Molly that he would talk to his mom and see if they could get her some help. But it was his grandmother's turn not to reply. The door closed and they drove off to the campground. Molly would just have to silently worry. It was unlikely that the Wendigo would eat them. It didn't eat everyone who came through, or no one would camp there anymore. And as night fell and Molly lay down in her bed, the Wendigo approached her bedroom window.
"What's going on? Why are you afraid?"
Molly realized it could literally smell her fear, and knowing that she hadn't feared it in years, it was suspicious of her.
What are you hiding from me, children? Do you think I won't be able to contain myself when I smell their blood? Your children. I don't sense them in there with you, and your children are grown. What is it you're trying to hide from me, Molly? What don't you want me to know? It's the summer now, isn't it? I wonder if the campground is busy. Oh, it seems you know that it is. Oh, Molly, I smell your blood in the trees, and it's so young. These aren't your children. These are your grandchildren, Molly. Oh, Molly, they smell so familiar, so sweet. I'm going to devour them, Molly. I'm going to eat your grandchildren.
The Wendigo pressed his goat-like face up to the glass to make sure she saw him, and she realized he had been there to torment her all these years after all. Molly sat up, climbed out of bed, and walked over to the window to look it dead in the eye, and for the first time she spoke to it. You will do no such thing. She tried to threaten the creature twice her height. It smiled a very human smile, with its wide mouth and flat teeth, and without uttering another word, it turned and bounded off towards the highway, towards the forest. Molly was never prone to violence, but she had kept good care of her father's shotgun. She loaded it and ran through the front door in her pajamas and slippers. The Wendigo was already out of view. It had already crossed the highway. It had already entered the park. She ventured into the brush, toting her big flashlight. Molly knew where the main campground was, and headed there through the trees. She could see no sign that the Wendigo had passed by. It made such noise when it bounded. Surely it would have pushed the trees aside, or at least left massive hoof prints. Molly made it to the main campground. Several winding loops of pitch-black dirt road around a well-lit bathroom on the hill. Molly shone her flashlight from campsite to campsite, trying not to linger there too long and be rude. There were many tents and a few RVs. Molly had no idea which was her grandson's, but she assumed they were in a tent, since they had driven there in a car. She racked her brain trying to remember the make and the color, but all she could remember was that the color of the car was light. It was late, definitely after midnight, and the grounds were extremely quiet, except for the odd car crunching around on the gravel, coming back from some late-night adventure elsewhere. The headlights of a car were coming up behind Molly, and she tried to hide her shotgun at her side, knowing what sort of negative attention that might draw. She stepped off to the side of the road, allowing the car to pass her by. Inside was a young couple, and as they continued driving down the gravel, their headlights illuminated something massive. A 9-foot-tall, hairy creature with the hooves and knees of a goat. Its antlers almost made it look like a tree in this ashen light. Molly was too in shock to actualize what was happening. The couple's car came crashing into the beast, and silently, the car was lifted into the air and thrown far behind Molly, resulting in an even louder crash. The car landed on its roof, killing the couple inside instantly. The man's body was leaning on the horn. Molly couldn't believe how quietly the Wendigo had snuck into the campsite. Every time it approached her outside her house, it had been so loud. It must have really just wanted to torment her after all. Molly screamed into the night air, alerting everyone of the beast, and in conjunction with the car horn, people started emerging from their tents and RVs to look around. Molly pointed her flashlight at the creature, who was smirking at her as it slinked into a campsite. Murmurs erupted around her. "What is that thing? We need to go." And a quiet panic took root in the park. The Wendigo's antlers ripped through someone's tent, and it began eating a man alive. People tried to run from the tent screaming, but the Wendigo held them down and took bites out of each of them, moving back and forth between them, sampling them one at a time. Molly's blood went cold as she thought it was her grandson he had gone straight for, but apparently the Wendigo's nose wasn't able to pinpoint his exact location. She noticed, out of the corner of its eye, it was watching her, taking cues from her body language to see if it had found her grandson, and when it realized that it hadn't, it moved on to the next campsite, leaving its half-eaten prey to bleed out. Molly looked around. She still couldn't find her grandson, but then saw him pile into the car with his friends a few campsites away. The tires squealed as they moved down the dirt road. Although her instinct was to put herself between the Wendigo and the car, she resisted the urge, knowing the Wendigo would see what car she was trying to protect. Instead, she started running towards the campers he was currently eating, trying to appear distraught in hopes that he would think he had found her grandson. The Wendigo got up and started bounding towards her grandson's car. Molly had no idea how the creature knew. It must have sensed her fear subside as her grandson's car began driving away. She screamed no and shot the Wendigo in the face. The pellets landed shallowly in the flesh of its face, but it didn't even slow down and bowled her over, knocking the wind out of the elderly woman. When she finally caught her breath and managed to get back onto her feet, the Wendigo was disappearing behind a row of trees along the turning road. She moved as quickly as she could through the forest between the bent road, and managed to cut off the beast as it was gaining ground on her grandson's car. The car sped by her, not seeming to notice her. The giant, lumbering beast was coming up on her quickly. She took aim and fired the shotgun once more at its face. This time, the bulk of the pellets hit it in the right eye, and the creature bellowed. It collapsed to the ground for a moment, and then picked itself up and scampered into the woods. It no longer seemed interested in chasing her grandson. Molly breathed a sigh of relief and collapsed onto a knee. This was more workout than she'd had in years, and between getting winded and cut up by the brambles, she was really not feeling well. She fell onto her back as the cars continued to drive by her, literally too exhausted to move, and finally, when the commotion had died half an hour later, she again had the strength to pick herself up and carry herself home. As she emerged carefully from the forest and peered across the highway, she noticed something on the roof of her tiny house. The glowing red eyes and the massive antlers stuck out like a sore thumb next to the moon. It sat up like a dog on her roof, just watching her as she crossed the street towards it. She wasn't afraid of it. She fully expected to die, and she fully expected the Wendigo to try to make it as painful and slow as possible. It leapt into the air as she moved up her driveway and came crashing down in front of her, staring her dead in the eye.
Molly, you angered me tonight. I want you to know that I'm going to devour your grandson. I have not left these forests in many years. I'll make an exception for him. I'm going to stalk him. I'm going to find out more about his life than you even know. I'm going to devour him, and then I'm going to come back and tell you all about it.
Molly looked up to meet the creature's gaze. She put a hand on one of its antlers. If you're going to eat me, then do it. Otherwise, get out of my way. The Wendigo smirked, salivating down its animal chin. It stepped aside to watch her pass into her house, standing to its full height, trying to intimidate her. She paid it no mind, and in 10 minutes, after she crawled into bed, she heard it one last time through the window.
I'll talk to you later, Molly.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to that story. It's the same Wendigo in both stories, by the way, in case that wasn't clear. So this is technically a sequel, but you can watch it first. Like, it doesn't really matter when you see it. And with that said, please check out my other Wendigo story called The Wendigo. Until next time, embrace the beautiful dark.